As I say, lots and lots of entrepreneurs and businesses start with someone like you 3 years at least before you plan to exit. It's not an inconsiderable investment, but by golly, it's worth it. If you remember, there was an interpretation, wasn't there, one clause that made a six-figure difference either way, depending on which way you interpreted it. And thankfully, you were able to negotiate to interpret it in a way that was favourable to us. I can't stress how important that is to have the right professional advisors in at the right time in the business.
Dr. Richard Strongman, you were the former owner of Harvest Fine Foods, and you sold the company to Bidfood some time ago. So we're here to have a conversation about your experience. Not everybody gets to sell a company. It's usually a once-in-a-lifetime thing. So we want to tease out the emotions, those moments that you went through in that journey, not just in the sale process, but the run-up to it. So thank you for being with us. A starter, let's just go back and have a look at Harvest Fine Foods and what that business was. So perhaps you could just give us a little bit of an overview of the business, what it did, the size of the business when you started it, and what it arrived at the end.
Okay, so I think when I joined the business, I was incredibly naive. I'd worked in a very highly regulated industry, technical capacity, so my understanding of business in the broader sense was virtually nil. Naively, on reflection, when my brother invited me to come and join the business and I said yes, it wasn't until 12 months later when I finally realised what I'd got myself into. And at the time, the business was a very small affair. Primarily, we did a range of dry stores, and we did them mainly within Southbourne and Bournemouth. And we turned over around about £500,000 a year. And what my vision for it was I thought, I'm going to retire at the age of 40, because 40 seemed very old back then. I was going to set it up so that it was almost a passive income. But I had no idea how big I would have to build the business in terms of scale in order to achieve the lifestyle that I wanted to and the financial security that I wanted to, and actually the sense of accomplishment. Those first, I'm going to say 15 years were really just growing the business for the sake of growing the business, with not really a clear sense of purpose or direction about where we were going, why we were going there. So I think we got to a point where we'd grown the business to 11.5 million turnover, had about 120 employees, and we were occupying 6 warehouses of about 22,000 square feet in Christchurch. And we were bursting at the seams, quite honestly. But thanks to Nick and his team, as we'd taken successive leases on each new property, they advised me, make them all coterminous. And so we came to a point where in around about 2015, our leases were all coterminous, and we had a decision to make. Do we renew them and carry on struggling in premises and on an industrial estate which was not really fit for purpose? Or do we roll the dice and go for it? And of course, that's what we decided to do.
Fantastic new premises at that time.
Yeah, big step.
Large refrigerated section, loads of room for all of the vehicles, and all under one roof at that stage, I think.
Pretty much. We took the new premises on with a huge increase in capacity. Went from 22,000 square feet to 56,000 square feet. Invested an awful lot of money in this. We had a very clear sense of what turnover we wanted to achieve, EBITDA, what multiple of EBITDA we wanted to achieve in terms of the sale, and who we were going to sell it to, and when.
But it was quite an accomplishment. I mean, you took the business from £500,000 to just short of £30 million turnover. And I'm sure, as you've said in your words, a hugely competitive environment. So you had in your mind the timing was coming right to sell. So how did you go about finding the right people to help you sell the company? At what point did that process start?
Nick and Steele Raymond have been my solicitors now for many years, and trusted in every facet of everything I've done within the business. And I can't stress how important that is, to have the right professional advisors in at the right time in the business. I've been working with Nick for years. You and I got on famously, and I trusted you, importantly. I didn't want to go with one of the big M&A organisations or an accountancy firm that offer that kind of service. I like the boutique approach. And so it was a real kind of bonus for me that you two had worked together on so many projects before. That was just a clincher, really. That just made the decision incredibly easy. Well, I've always worked in my business life on relationships, and we've built a relationship over a long period of time. I think in both of your cases, there was never ever a hard sale or a hard push. So like most things, it starts off small. You do a little lease together, and that goes really well. And you think, oh, then you phone up with a little bit of advice on something else, and it just builds over time. But there'll always be a niche for that human-to-human connection. I think it's absolutely fundamental. We had a monogamous sale process in the end, didn't we? So we had one suitor, but it was a very serious proposition. So we didn't go to the open market and tender the business in the way that you normally would. But I recognise that that was a fairly unique situation.
It was. It's unusual that it's a one-to-one, sort of connection, as it were. And of course, there's a little bit of spade work that's done at the beginning part of that, once that conversation is in play, to say where the offer, where the deal might sit in terms of attractiveness. So
I think, as I think you'd probably agree, we established a very good brand and a very good business and a very desirable business for someone to acquire.
Definitely, yeah.
Which I think will add to that valuation model. They knew our business and understood it very well, having been our closest competitor and our biggest competitor for decades. And they also knew some of the key personnel within my management team. And it wasn't an accident that I recruited those people, because I wanted people that understood that industry very well and people that would be known quantities to any prospective buyer in the future. So a lot of what we did, including the move, but changing to a different purchasing consortium, the people that we employed, the location that we chose to open up a much bigger territory for us to work within, were all very deliberate and pointed decisions.
It's funny, reflecting a little bit on my memories going back, and I remember there was pieces in the jigsaw puzzle, and I remember there were focal points, if you like, at the time. I think one of them was money, because of course at the you remember how complicated offer documents are, and you accept a deal offered by a buyer, and there's various moving parts in those numbers. If you remember, I'm not sure if you recall.
No, I do. I remember very well. There was an interpretation, wasn't there? One clause that made a six-figure difference either way, depending on which way you interpreted it. And thankfully, you were able to negotiate to interpret it in a way that was favourable to us. For me, I wanted a clean exit, if you remember. I wanted to walk away with no workout, no retained funds or anything linked to that workout. And in reality, we were paid in full on the day of completion, weren't we? I stayed on a consultancy role 3 days a month, notionally, for 3 months, after which they didn't require my services anymore. So that, to me, represents just about the perfect clean exit.
So what about professional advisors? Because I'm guessing that you probably would lean on the idea that it's probably a good thing to have professional advisors helping sell a business, or maybe not, perhaps.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So when we started this process, my finance director at the time had been involved in some M&As in his previous roles on the sell side, and so felt that he could put together an information memorandum. And then some very smart part of me just nudged me and said, show this to Justin. And so I sent it over to you, and you said, Richard, I'm going to advise you, as my friend, that whether you decide to use us or not, for God's sake, don't send them that, because it's rubbish and it will only negatively impact on your end exit valuation and so on.
You just reminded me of all of that, as I'd forgotten about, actually. So it does make me smile thinking back to it.
No, I don't want to speak ill of my FD at the time, because he did it in all good conscience and thinking that it was the right thing to do. But again, the trust element, isn't it? Justin says, look, I don't care whether you do it with me or not, but for goodness sake, don't go with that document. It's not an inconsiderable investment and to put together a professional information memorandum, but by golly, it's worth it, right? I mean, what you did to present our business, I looked and thought, cool, I'll buy that business. It looks bloody marvellous.
I think I'll keep it, yeah.
I'll keep that. But I think, as I say, because we had that monogamous process to begin with, I think we were okay to engage with you later. But I think if I was doing it again and we were starting without a particular buyer in mind, then I would want to engage with someone like you a lot sooner in that process, because there's a lot more you can do to prepare the business for sale and to improve your exit valuation by changing the mechanics of how you run the business in the run-up to it, once you know what a prospective buyer is looking for when they're reaching their valuation. That would be my advice, is start with someone like you 3 years at least before you plan to exit.
When you embarked on the process then, you mentioned you maybe didn't know that much about the process. What surprised you the most on the sort of from finding a buyer through to completion perhaps? I'm just interested from your side. I mean, it's easy for me and Justin in a sense because we see these transactions day in, day out, week in, week out. But for a lot of people, as Justin says, most people in fact will only sell one company in their lifetime. So it's just interesting for us to know.
It's such an important thing, actually. And the fact that you guys recognise that, for most people, they will have one business. And if they're lucky, they'll get to sell it. And it's a huge emotional journey. I mean, if you like, although I bought the business from my father, I feel like I was the founder. It was a completely different proposition back then. And so I want somebody I get one chance to sell it and get the best deal I'm going to get. So I needed to have a team that I can trust to make that happen for me. So I think the emotional journey is just the biggest thing, right? How many times during the process, Nick, did I phone you up when the buyer's solicitor going through the due diligence were asking just petty questions, really, that were of very little significance in the overall thing. And it just felt like we were gearing up to chisel the price. And I just wasn't game for that. And I was so emotionally invested. And it was just great that I could palm that off onto the two of you. And you just say, calm down, Rich. It's just normal. We'll deal with this. Don't worry about it.
I think that's a really important point, though, because I think that like any process you haven't been through before, going through it for the first time, the nature and the level of the scrutiny and the forensic approach of the buyer, someone who's going to be paying several £1 million for a business, they want to know every last thing about the business. And where you've got a business that goes back 10, 15, 20 years or more, there's a lot to look at.
You know, you can get so easily derailed in that due diligence process if you haven't tied up your share capital.
Yeah.
And the share movement. So, you know, we had changes of shareholders over a number of years.
Yeah, we did.
My brother left the business. We had another business partner who also left the business. And if you don't tidy up that paperwork at the time and get everything properly signed off, that can unhinge the whole process further down the line.
If you don't do it properly, then you're either doing it in the process, and that assumes that it can be corrected, you know, in the process, because some things, you know, Justin and I, not your transaction, we worked on other transactions where things like stamp duty hasn't been paid on historic share transfers or whatever. Well, if you're going back to HMRC to get stamp duty paid in a hurry, particularly when there's lots of fines and penalties to be calculated, in some cases over several years, it can take time. And if you've got a completion scheduled for 2 weeks' time or 3 weeks' time, and you've only just discovered this particular issue, you know, it can be a challenge. And as you say, you know, you're balancing up a lot of emotions at the time as well. So you're trying to have this kind of detailed hat on to answer all these questions. At the same time, you've got your own emotions going on. So it's quite an intense period, I think.
Well, also you're trying to keep it secret from 160 employees, and you're trying to keep a lid on everything and make sure that it doesn't get out into the public domain.
And run the business
in case it falls over, and continue to run the business well. Yeah.
Did you worry about customers in the process in terms of retention of customers or customers being unsettled or?
Yeah, I did. And of course, you know, when you're selling to one of your biggest competitors as well, that made the due diligence process particularly hard. Because, you know, they wanted to see our product lists, our price lists, our customer lists, and so on and so forth. And I didn't want to turn over to each customer. I didn't want to share that information.
We redacted it, didn't we, until fairly later on in the stage, I think. Yeah.
And actually, do you know what? Credit to the buyer. They were absolutely brilliant about that. They didn't push that agenda at all, did they, really?
No.
So you've had the benefit of doing this once, and it's quite intensive, the process, right? So what would you advise business owners if they have to go and sell their company? What would the advice be?
Lots of things, to be honest with you. And I do take the opportunity whenever I can to talk to people and advise them this. But I think the starting point is always know what your exit is and when, and stick to it, actually. I think it's a real temptation. You set this thing up and you have this idea when you're going to leave, and then things are going well. Say, oh, no, just carry on. Don't. Stop. Get out. You know, stick to your plan. Have a plan. I think, as I say, lots and lots of entrepreneurs and businesses start as passion projects without really any clear insight into who's going to buy their business at some point in the future. I mean, I challenge people on this all the time. Who is going to buy your business? Why do they want to buy it? Because that's what you think is going to be your exit. If you're not just going to, run it as an income and then close it down at some point in the future, everyone wants to sell it and get some big ticket at the end of it. So who's going to buy it? Why are they going to buy it? What are you offering them that they don't already have that's going to persuade them that they want to do it? And how are you going to engineer the best price and opportunity to do that? Is your market in a position of acquisition at the moment? So actually the food service market is in a period of consolidation at the moment. And there are a number of bigger buyers taking over smaller companies. But there's definitely a lot that people can do at the beginning of their journey to enable that exit further down the line.
Okay, so Dr. Richard Strongman, thank you very much for coming and sharing your story, my friend.
Thank you very much for helping it have a happy ending.